Good morning. Welcome to the Mandel JCC 2020-21 Jewish Book Festival. Thank you for being a part of this special event. My name is Jessica Robbins, and I'm the Director of Early Childhood Services at the Mandel JCC. As soon as the J recognized that it would not be safe to congregate in person this year, our volunteers and staff excitedly took on a challenge and found creative ways to continue the long-standing book festival tradition of sharing interesting and engaging authors with our loyal Cleveland audience. Thank you for joining us on this new virtual literary journey. The generosity of the book festival sponsors make the program possible each year. I'd like to give a special thanks to our major funders, Friends of Jewish Lifelong Learning, the Henry and Eugenia Green Family Foundation, the Iris Vilosky Zoller Lecture Series of the Mandel JCC, and the Jewish Book Council. We are also grateful for the critical government support we receive from the Ohio Arts Council and Ohio Humanities. Please visit our website at mandeljcc.org to see a complete listing of all of our generous book festival sponsors. An enthusiastic thank you to our devoted book festival committee, led by Shelley Lewis, Lisa Mayers, and Beth Rosenthal. Our creative and devoted co-chairs, who especially during this uniquely challenging year, have been absolutely integral in creating a diverse and stimulating program. And finally, a wholehearted thank you to the talented Mandel JCC staff, especially to Deborah Bobrow and Nancy Zimmerman, who have been and continue to work tirelessly behind the scenes to put this all together. This morning's program is being supported by several Mandel JCC program departments, Early Childhood, J Day Camps, and Camp Wise. Within all of these programs, you could find something for every child here at the J. In order to learn more and see if one of these programs is the right fit for your child or grandchild, please check out our website to learn more about our children and youth programs. We're also very grateful for the support of Dr. Julie Hertzer of Advanced Pediatrics, who will be moderating today's conversation. Dr. Julie Hertzer is a pediatrician in Beechwood, Ohio. She is a fellow of the American Academy of Pediatrics. She earned her BA from Tufts and her MD from Indiana University. Dr. Hertzer's training was completed at the George Washington University School of Medicine Children's National Medical Center. She has been in practice for over 20 years with special interests in child development, adolescent care, and nutrition. She has served on the boards of the Mandel Jewish Community Center and Belfair JCB and has helped develop both a puberty and a nutrition program for Shaker Heights Elementary Schools. Hi, Julie. Welcome.
Thank you, Jessica. I'm so pleased to be moderating today's discussion, especially when the topic feels so much more important than ever before. Dr. Abigail Gewirtz is a child psychologist and a leading expert on families under stress. She is a professor in the University of Minnesota's College of Education and Human Development. She has consulted to national and international organizations, including the U.S. Congress and UNICEF on parenting. She has conducted research in the US, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, and has been invited to speak widely in the US and across the world, specifically on parenting in times of stress. An urgent and necessary book, When the World Feels Like a Scary Place, brings solutions to a problem that is only going to get worse: how bad things are happening in the world affect children and how we can raise engaged and confident kids in spite of these problems. Dr. Abby offers a clear and truly practical guide to having the kind of tough conversations with your kids that really help. But it's not just how to talk to your kids, it's also what to say. The heart of the book is a series of conversation scripts with actual dialogue, talking points, prompts, and insightful asides, each tailored for different ages and centered around different issues. She shows how to let the child lead, how to not make the problem worse by saying more than a child needs to know, and how to check in with yourself to make sure your own anxiety doesn't color the conversation. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Abby.
Thank you, Julie. I appreciate it. It's a treat to be with you.
Great. Well, so why don't we just get started with what was the inspiration for you for writing this book in the first place?
Well, it's funny, since the book came out in June, people have been asking me, did the pandemic just make you decide to write the book? And I thought, if only I could write a book and have it published in 3 months. Wow. No. I decided to write the book back in 2016. I felt back in 2016 that the world was becoming a scarier place. My own children, I have 4 of them. The youngest had just entered adolescence. So I didn't have very young children, but I looked around at my neighbors and friends and those with young children. And we talked about how there was really no roadmap for talking about what felt to them like an increasingly scary world. What's interesting is, and I note this in the book, that the world, if you look, for example, at violence, over the last 30 years, violence in the United States has actually gone down. But we don't feel like that, right? We feel much more scared. In fact, if you look at the data, you're a pediatrician, so you probably know this. Anxiety and depression in young people and sadly suicidality has only increased over the last 10 years. So I wanted to think, I wanted to I spent some time thinking about why that is. And what I identified were 5 classes of scary world events. I call them scary world events, things outside the home that are affecting children today in a way that maybe wouldn't have happened a generation ago. And I'll give you some examples. In 2016, we really started seeing the advent of routine lockdown drills in schools. In fact, the day I went to meet my new editor at Workman Press, we sat down and without much preamble, she said to me, listen, you're a child psychologist. I have a kindergartner. New York City Public School, his New York City Public School has just sent me an email saying that tomorrow is going to be their first lockdown drill. What am I supposed to say to my child? And so, that's the kind of thing that we didn't have to worry about a generation ago. Not that there was no violence in schools, because unfortunately this, back in 1999, Columbine High School, there through the 90s, there were shootings. So that's one sort of set of events, violence, I call them. You can look at things like hate crimes. Over the last 5 years, hate crimes have risen, particularly anti-Semitic hate crimes, year on year on year. What about climate and weather? You probably in Ohio have experienced the same as us in Minnesota and Texas and Florida and everywhere, that we are seeing more severe weather events and more of them. And those are another sort of thing that we didn't have to think about as much a generation ago. There's our divided society. Look, 2016 was an election year like 2020, and it was also a very divided election year with people worrying about what to say around the Thanksgiving table. And debates then, it was about immigration. And so there were all sorts of, and I felt very much, even from 2016 onwards, that the level of civility in our society, the level of discourse, unfortunately had been deteriorating. And then social justice issues. We have an ever widening gap between rich and poor. I think it's the largest in ever, possibly, certainly in more than a century. And so violence, climate, divided democracy, social justice issues. And the last one is technology. You, again, as a pediatrician, probably know that the average age at which an American child gets a cell phone is 10 years old. That brings a whole host of world events into the home through the cell phone that parents find it very, very difficult to monitor. So in a nutshell, that's why I decided to write the book.
Well, and it's so pertinent today. You probably never even would have thought that it would be. And, starting with the technology that you mentioned, I noticed you mentioned in the book that families just sometimes speak to each other only 3 minutes in a day. That's quite a statistic. How does group texting factor in? And is there any meaningful replacement for in-person communication that you have noticed with your patients?
I hate to say it so bluntly, but I don't think so, right? I don't. And You probably see this as a pediatrician too. I don't think there is any replacement for actually seeing each other face to face, which is why I think we're all suffering now as a society in our cocoons of our homes, and particularly our children. My goodness, think about adolescents. You know, the last people they want to be with often is their parents, and the people they most want to be with, they can't be with, or not safely, unless you put a mask on and you're far away and things like that. So I don't think, I mean, it's not to say that technology is all bad. And I make it very clear in the book, I would never tell parents what to do. Parents have to really be driven by their own values, which is something we discuss early on in the book. You know, decide what your values are and then put those into action. I can tell you how to discuss these issues with your kids, not what to say. But I really don't think that there is any replacement for face-to-face interaction.
And do you feel like we can use technology in a positive way? Since I think in the very beginning of your book, when I was reading it, you talked about how the outside world comes in so quickly now. If 10-year-olds are getting cell phones, and in my practice, I've seen 1-year-olds who know how to manipulate their parents' phone. They might not have their own phone, but they're using it well. So I wonder if there's a way for parents to use it sort of for the good.
Oh, for sure, absolutely. I mean, I would never say that technology is an all bad thing, not at all. I mean, imagine what it would be like if we were back in 1918 with the flu pandemic with no technology. I mean, technology has enabled our kids to continue learning despite the fact that they can't be in school, many of them. And so there are some tremendous things about technology. I mean, look, you just Dr. Google, you know, will tell us anything we want to know. It's quite remarkable. And it also has brought huge benefits to the developing world. And, you know, we have knowledge at our fingertips that we never would have had. And I think there are also wonderful ways in which, for example, social media can galvanize social movements and also, you know, young people to do good things in the world. So I really do think there are some huge, you know, good things about technology in general and social media in particular. But we have to, as parents, go into it with our eyes wide open. And I give several examples in the book. You know, you talk about the 1-year-old who knows how to navigate his parents' phone. I give the example of the 3-year-old who's supposedly who is on YouTube Kids while his mom is doing the supermarket shopping. And at the cash register, she looks over and sees that something has snuck onto YouTube Kids that is wholly inappropriate. And she has to deal with it.
Yeah, I thought that was a great, maybe for people who haven't read the book, you could go through that. That was, I thought, so interesting because it is a first reaction to grab a phone away and to say, oh my gosh, what are you doing? And so actually that sort of leads into some of your, what I looked as protocols that you were developing for people to not have to recreate the wheel every time an event comes into place. So maybe that would be a good place to start because that's a little kid and we can move on to the next stage. But I just thought that was so helpful.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so, you know, let me start by saying that the world comes into a child's life through the bubble of the family. So, and that is even more so with, you know, the younger the child is, the more that is the case. And so early on in the book, so as you pointed out, you know, I spend the first sort of few chapters of the book, you know, about 40% of the book, focused on helping parents to develop skills to be able to engage in meaningful, what I call essential conversations with their children around difficult topics. And so the first thing to do is to recognize what happens when scary things or outside events that make you feel stressed, what happens to you? So let's take something you've just heard. Let's take a sort of relatively benign example. You've just heard something on the radio. You know, it's a snowy day. You have to really pay attention to the road. You're driving home from the store and you switch on the radio and something you hear makes you really annoyed and upset, right? And you may or may not be aware of what that does to you, but you get home, you're still sort of tense. You bring the stuff into the groceries into the house. You ask your child to come and help you with the groceries, and they don't come immediately, and then you get really grouchy. And many of us do that. It's very common. if we take a moment to recognize what's happened, which is that something happened to make us feel stressed, instead of taking a breath and recognizing that, understanding where it is, and grounding ourselves, we've allowed the stress to infiltrate the house by sort of spilling over into our grouchiness with our kids. And so, early on in the book, I say the first thing to do is put your own mask on before assisting others. Like, as not many of us haven't been on planes for a while, but if we were to go on a plane, that's what they would tell us. And all that means is taking a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of space when something happens. And that could involve you, it could involve your child. And so in the example that we were talking about, the child is, your 3-year-old is sitting in the supermarket, in the cart, and you look over and your stuff's all on the, on the sort of at the register, and you're about to pay, and you look over and you see something horrific that your child is watching, completely inappropriate for a 3-year-old. And you're so shocked, you can't even sort of take a moment to breathe, and you snatch the iPad away from the child. And what does the child, what does the child do? I mean, what would your child do? This is your child or grandchild, if you snatched it away. Well, he thinks, I must have done something wrong, or what's happening? He is so taken aback by the intensity of his mom's action that he starts crying and yelling, and the mom's embarrassed, and the stuff's on the, waiting at the register, and she just pays and leaves. What if we rewound and mom looks over and sees this horrific scene that her child is watching, and she just takes a half a second to take a breath, recognize that she is feeling horrified and incredibly anxious, and allows that to just sit there for, again, half a second, and recognizes that she has the opportunity to distract her child by saying, oh, look at the candy, special treat, because things went so well today. Which one do you want, this one or this one? And as he turns around to decide which piece of candy she wants, she slides the iPad out of his hands and into her bag. He's sort of a bit distracted, and, she grabs the candy, and he might say, iPad, whatever. But she manages to take him out of the supermarket, and in the car, she's then able to engage in an essential conversation that isn't about his tantrum or his great upset because she's been so horrified that her emotion has spilled over to her child. So that's sort of the first step in the essential conversation. And I don't know, Julie, if you want to go into the rest now, or if you want to take another example, or I'm aware of talking for a long time.
No, I going forward is great. I was thinking that something that I usually tell my families also is just to low key as much as you can. They always take your cue. And if you get excited in response to them, or in another for another reason, they're always going to become upset. So sort of flat affect, which is a psychiatry word, and remain calm. I think that's natural for some people, and it isn't for others, again, which is why I liked your step-by-step. Yeah, were you going to say you're going to maybe go on to another example, like where you do a step-by-step approach? I love that. It's so helpful for people to who aren't naturally like super calm.
Right. So it's interesting because I think you're pointing out, like, we're all different, our temperaments are different. And by the way, I might be different than my husband or partner, and we might be different from our child. We might be both extroverts and have an introverted child, a slow to warm up, more sensitive child. We can't just bounce him around from place to place or party, or, we're going to have to prepare him, for example. I might be more sensitive to certain things than my spouse, in which case I'm going to ask him or her or partner to take the lead on certain conversations. Your comment about, sort of calm, I think is really important. I think there's also, and you pointed out there's a style, temperament, and a style. So I talk about the difference between the stiff upper lip. Growing up as a child in England, my dad was a stiff upper lip. He'd grown up in World War II, and he never expressed almost never, not never, but very rarely expressed emotion, but we knew exactly what he was feeling, which was kind of scary sometimes. On the other hand, at the other end of the spectrum, you have the sort of, 60s, be real, let it all out, yell and scream, kind of thing. Most people aren't at one end or the other, but we're somewhere in the middle. And the issue about the calm is more about like taking the space between when the emotions hit you and the decision to act on the emotion. And I think that takes practice. Yoga, exercise, meditation, taking a walk, taking a breath, all the prayer for some people, all those things help us create that space. And I say to some people, it can be like a half a second breath in the supermarket. It can be if your child comes in with big emotions and you're about to, be sort of also react with big emotions, taking 5 seconds to say, come sit down, let me go grab a glass of water and a cookie. That can give you enough time to sort of stand up, feel your feet in your shoes, remember where you are, take a breath and make a decision. So I call it the difference between reacting impulsively, which is way too easy to do, by the way, particularly on social media, and responding intentionally, which is where you take that space. So spending a lot of time on it, but I think that is arguably one of the most crucial steps in these essential conversations, because it makes the conversation so different. And because you've read the book, that every conversation of the 30 something conversations I have in the book, there's a red light conversation, which is what happens when you react impulsively, and a green light conversation, which is when you have the time to take a breath and decide how to respond.
So why don't we take it to like a teenager now? Because I bet a lot of people on here have teenagers, and we always think that the toddlers are the hardest, but that's until you have a teenager.
As someone with 2 teenagers, although they're at the upper end, 18 and 19.
Sure. So maybe you can give us one of the examples of what we might even experience. Someone just asked a question about COVID and how can we help teenagers with their anxiety and a lot of these disappointments with the COVID ramifications, which is just enormous for every teenager in every aspect of school and sports and friends and so on.
Right. So I'm going to take a real example. It's a sort of a real / hypothetical example. I have my youngest of 4 is a senior in high school, and she played tennis, and they were able to play because tennis, fortunately, is relatively easy to socially distance. They didn't do doubles, they only did singles. They told the kids, if one kid comes down with COVID, we're canceling all school sports for the rest of the season. So let's say your child comes home and having found out that someone else on the team has tested positive, and let's say it's your 16-year-old who comes home, and let's take a girl, 16-year-old girl, she comes home and she whooshes in the door, she's been, I don't know, walking around walking the dog or something, and she got a buzz on her cell phone and found out that someone had tested positive. All you hear is the door slams. And how many times have you told her not to slam the door? The dog runs in with his leash still on, and you're irritated. And then she says, "You will not believe it. John tested positive for COVID, and they're gonna cancel the whole season. And you know what? He went to parties and we told him not to go party because we knew that was going to happen. And I'm so mad." And you have probably many reactions, which is, first of all, there's that irritation of coming into the house, in the classic teenage way, because in the teenage world, they are the center of the world. And, that's just the way it is developmentally. And then, so you're sort of annoyed, and then you're worried as soon as you hear what she says. And you have a lot of feelings, including, wow, when did she last see John? And is she at risk? And oh my goodness, this was not what I expected or needed today. There's too much going on and I'm worried about my mom and etc. You take a deep breath and then you walk over to her and you say, wow, honey, that is a lot. Come sit down. Come sit down. And I bet you must have a lot of feelings. And she may or may not tell you what she's feeling. But let's say she does. Yeah, I'm so mad. And you might say, I would be, I bet you're mad. And I can see from your face that your eyes are like really looking intense and your brow is furrowed and your mouth is downturned. And I wonder if you have some other feelings as well. And she might or might not take a breath and say, yeah, I'm really worried because, John's girlfriend is my friend. And I don't know. And I just saw her yesterday. And like, what if he gave it to her? And what if she gave it to me? And then you are going to take another deep breath because at this point you are feeling pretty worried as well. But you're going to remember that this is about her. And so you say, wow, I bet you're feeling anxious. And boy, if my friend had a potentially really bad infectious illness or might be at risk of getting it like COVID, I would feel really anxious. I would feel frustrated and angry, and I would feel really anxious too. How about this? Look, let me grab you. Can I grab you a hot drink or a glass of water or a snack? Do you have a few minutes? Let's sit down. Let's talk about it. And she may or may not, right? She may, being a teen, want to find out more, and that's okay. Schedule a conversation for later if that's the case. But often teens, when they come in, they want to talk. And so I find as a mom and also as a clinician that, when you want to, when your child wants to talk, you better grab it for the teen. You better grab that because that opportunity may not be coming around again soon. So you say, hey, listen, let me grab us both a cup of tea and sit down and say, tell me what happened. No. So what we've done is what I've done so far is we've identified her emotions. So why do we do that? We do that because emotions are very powerful signals. If we take anxiety, many of us right now are dealing with more anxiety than we maybe need to function well. But also, if you think about it, some people have less anxiety than they need, and that's also a dangerous thing. Anxiety is a signal that tells us that something dangerous is happening, right? I think it is appropriate for us to feel anxious right now when we are talking inside with someone who's not wearing a mask and who's not related to us, right? That is an appropriate level of anxiety because of the danger of COVID. However, so it's very important for us to recognize and teach our children about emotions as signals. Kids learn about emotions in 3 ways: by watching us deal with our own emotions, by experiencing the way we deal with their emotions, and by having discussions about emotions. And so when you say to your child, why did you slam the door? You're worried. You don't need to be worried. There's no need to worry. Everything's going to be fine. You're sending a very important message about emotions, which is my emotion is not that emotion. Your worry, your anger is not valid. And it can be worse, right? And what we know from a lot of research on emotions is that when parents routinely dismiss or invalidate or sort of punish their children's emotions, kids are at greater risk for things like anxiety and depression. On the other hand, if you take the time to nurture their emotions by sort of helping them to identify what it looks like on the face, what it feels like in the body. I don't think I gave the example, but it could be like, wow, you look really tense. I don't know about you, but when I feel anxious, I have that knot in the pit of my stomach. So sort of labeling emotions, identifying them, linking with physical sensations, and then validating them. If it was me, I would feel the same way. So those are the first steps in our essential conversation after you've taken the time to deal with your own emotions. And then you are inviting your child to sit and talk. Tell me what happened. Now, often as parents, we think we know, right? I know, she told me when she yelled when she came into the house, which is, this one has COVID and she's worried that this one's going to get COVID. Okay. But there's more, always more. And often as parents, we feel like we know what they're saying. And when we actually listen, we're like, oh. So let's say my 16-year-old sits down, and when I actually take the time to listen, I put my phone away and she puts her phone away and she just says, Mom, I feel I'm so disappointed. Sports was the only thing we had going on. I miss my friends so much. I can't bear being cooped up in my room all day. I don't know what I'm going to do. And I'm really worried I'm going to get COVID. And what about grandma? Like we saw grandma last week. Is she going to get sick? Are you going to get sick? And you're a nurse, and I'm really worried about you. And you're like, whoa. Now, I'm not saying that every 16-year-old will tell you that, but I'm saying that if we don't listen actively to our kids, and I talk about what that is in the book, active listening, if we can't do that, we won't hear everything. If we do listen, we may run the risk of having to deal with a lot more big emotions of our own, that we have to deal with that. But if we don't, we won't know the extent of what they're dealing with. Why is it important for us to know the extent of it? Because then we can help them deal with it. So the last phase of the essential conversation, in my mind, is one of the most important, which is the problem solving phase. And we only should implement that after we've had lots of opportunity to talk about emotions and to listen. And that phase is helping your child feel less worried, helpless. And the issue, of course, as you know, as a physician, is that in this pandemic and with all the other things that are going on in our world, it's too easy for us, even adults, to feel helpless and disempowered. And if we feel like that, how much more so do our kids feel like that? And so it's really important in this last phase of the conversation to address the issues that our kids are feeling. Okay, you feel disappointed, you feel frustrated, angry, and also worried. Let's talk about how you can feel, less anxious, less worried. And there are strategies for doing that, less, frustrated. What can you do about that? That's one issue. And the second issue is what your child told you, which is, I have nothing going on anymore, right? That's a concrete problem. I have no sports. I'm doing school from home, and I can't deal with that. I need to have some kind of interaction. That is a concrete problem. And that is a problem that you and your child can troubleshoot and brainstorm and problem solve together. And your problem solving might go something like this, which is, I recognize what you're saying, that sports is over, you're doing school from home, and I bet it feels really awful. And we've talked about the feelings. Let's think about ways that you can have more interactions safely with your friends. And I'm going to have some ideas, and you're going to have some ideas. And together, like, I'm not promising that I'll be able to say yes to all your ideas, but let's come up with ideas together. And you might even do this as a family, depending on all sorts of things. But so you might say, look, the weather's not too bad right now. I know that, I'm fine with you guys going to the park. And, what about the local, youth group? I know that they've got some things that going on in the park. And your child might say, well, John is having another party. Can I get, I want to go, right? That's going to be a no. Let's say that's going to be a no for you, but that's okay. This is brainstorming. And in brainstorming, all ideas are good ideas. You write them all down. And at the end, you might say, look, I think you know what I'm going to say about going to a party with another 25 kids with no one wearing masks. But the other idea you had, which was to, to get together with A, B, and C, who are in your bubble, who, haven't been interacting with anyone else, that's fine. And you can even go and do Z, I don't know what, so the idea is that you come up with an agreement that consists of her ideas and your ideas. And why that is so important is because you want to finish your essential conversation with your child feeling that there is something they can do.
No, I think that's great. And I wonder, have you found, either in your experience or with your patients, that you're more likely to get good feedback and options from teenagers, young children, school age, or middle school? Do you feel like as a parent you need to be sort of coming up with more ideas the younger the child is, or do they come up with pretty good ideas for problem solving too?
Yeah, I mean, I think we often make the assumption, and I've learned about these processes, not just through my clinical work, which I have, very small practice, mostly through my research. And for the last 10 years, I've had the sort of great honor and privilege of doing work with thousands of military families, right? Talk about stress with a parent who served in Iraq or Afghanistan. One of the things that we found with this problem solving process is that kids of any age will come up with ideas. The issue, I think, for us parents is that often we not only do we think we know best, and partly that's our job, parents are their kids' best teachers, but we want to make it better quickly. And the quickest way to make it better, often we think, is by saying, you're scared of the dark, let me get you a nightlight, right? So not only does that subvert the whole emotions process, but also it tells children, I don't have any agency here. My mom will tell me what to do all the time. That's okay when children are very, very, very little, but even as young kids, even as young as 2 and 3 years old, I mean, you probably tell parents this, you can give choices to kids. When they're 2 years old, you can say you can wear the blue or you can wear the red. Pick the one you want. You can have apples or you can have bananas. Which one do you want? And so I really am an advocate, and I have seen children that young be able to say what they want. And sometimes, the younger the child, the more you might have to give some choices and say, do you like this? Or what do you think about this? Or I know you said you wanted to do this. Do you have any other, what else? So you have to lay out the conditions.
So somebody just asked, and this was a good question. Your example was what maybe your daughter may or may not, but let's take the tack that they are willing to talk to you. What about a child who isn't willing to talk to you? And a second part of that question would be, of course, would that person maybe need professional help? How do you decide at that point as a parent that they're not talking to you? Maybe they should be talking to someone else. And taking that step. That may not be exactly what's in your book, but looking at like what a parent should do in the opposite situation.
No, that's a great question. And I think I'm going to take it in two parts, right? I think one thing which I do talk about, I talk about both issues in the book. The first thing is a child who doesn't want to talk. So let's talk separately about the child who's really distressed and also doesn't want to talk. And so we'll talk about that separately. But for kids are all different, right? Some kids are really private and they just are, or they're more reticent, or they just don't want to talk, or they're teenagers and they don't want anything to do with you. I think one of the things that's really disconcerting to children of any age is the idea of being intruded upon, right? So when you sit down and you look at your child and you say, especially your 12 or 13-year-old, and you say, tell me what you're feeling. It can feel awful for the child, right? Stop mind reading, leave me alone. So I think the question is I'm really glad that you raised it. Let's not make our child feel intruded upon, and let's not make our child feel like we can mind read them, and let's give our child space. And let's also find an opportunity to have these discussions. And so in the book, I talk about sort of ways to do that, right? If you have a child who just does not want to talk about emotions at all, what about modeling it? You have dinner together, you and your spouse have an essential conversation between you. And it could go something like, honey, it was really a stressful day at work because I had to give this presentation and it was so hard to do it on Zoom. And and then the Zoom went out and I said the wrong thing and I was muted and whatever it is. And your spouse says to you, look, how did that make you feel? And you might say, well, I just sort of lost my breath. And then I just had I felt sick and it was so awful. And I'm sure there's going to be blowback. And so your spouse might say, I remember when that happened to me. And that that's something your child is dealing with. They don't want to talk about it. That's fine. But they're watching you two model that
Mhm.
kind of a conversation. So I
Mhm.
think that's one issue. The other thing is, if you yeah, I was on a panel with a couple of other authors, and one of them was talking about how they wanted to talk. It wasn't they, someone they knew wanted to talk with their child about something, and they chased their child into the bathroom and then banged on the door and said, we have to talk about it. And I'm not an advocate of that kind of thing. But most parents drive their kids places, and driving is a great opportunity to have a discussion where you don't need to look at each other, which is sometimes so much easier for teens, right? They're in the back, or maybe they're in the front, but you're both looking straight ahead, and you can just say something, leave it in the air. That's it. Same with walking the dog, right? You're both looking straight ahead. So there are opportunities, if you have to have a discussion. And sometimes, like, there are sort of examples I give in the book where, like, you found out your child's been uh, posting photos on social media that, while they're not horrendous, you worry a little bit about them, right? Your child's not going to say anything to you, but you hear something from her friend's mom and you want to raise it, and you don't want to be intrusive, but this is an important thing to do. Car is such a great place to do it. So those are some examples. The second issue that you raised, which is, when is it time for my child to maybe get professional help? That, I think, is a combination. I would say, first and foremost, it's how distressed is your child, and unfortunately, we are seeing really increasing rates of anxiety and depression. I'm sure you're seeing that in your practice. So what I would say is, there are two things to think about. One is, to what extent is your child's distress interfering with her daily life? If he, or I should say his, because I've been using her, but let's say he can't get up in the morning to do online school, he won't go to sleep at night, or he's not eating properly, not sleeping properly. I think those are warning signs. And if that distress lasts longer than a month, it is time to seek help. And the other aspect to this, so it's interfering with daily functioning and or feeling lousy, right? So if you feel lousy, if your child feels awful and tells you they feel awful, and they aren't able um, to do the daily life things that they should be doing, that's, I think, a clear sort of signal that they need professional help. I would say, even if they are able to, you have some really high flying kids who are incredibly anxious and maybe depressed, but they still go do their schoolwork. You are their best teacher. You know them better than anyone else. I think many parents sort of have the sense, this is beyond me, especially if kids talk about hurting themselves. That's like a massive red light. Do seek help. And most mental health professionals are doing telehealth right now, but there's someone to talk to. And actually, my experience has been, with some teens I've worked with, that telehealth is better because it feels less intrusive than in person.
Yeah, I think it's easier to get to an appointment on
For
telehealth. And
sure.
I have, and the privacy issue, though, sometimes if people are listening in. But, I was wondering, you mentioned that you started, well, maybe you didn't start, but you work with military families, and they're under a lot of stress. Is that where you developed this protocol, or this way of doing things? And do you feel like it sort of it works for both equally? I mean, do the military families need different kinds of help?
So that's a great question. So what we developed, first with it not wasn't first with military families, but basically, I'm a parenting person. So I'm really interested in helping parents be their kids' best teachers. And most parenting programs are very behavioral. They focus on how to help children behave, right? Well, pro-social behavior. And I thought that was great. But what worried me was, for my whole career, I've worked with families affected by stress and trauma, not only in military families. For the last 10 years, it's primarily been military families, but I've worked with families affected um, by war, as in refugees and immigrant families, families affected by domestic violence, and other kinds of adversities. And what I felt was, it's all very well to teach parents behavioral parenting tools, But the problem is that when a parent has been through a traumatic event, emotions play a massive role in that emotions, and anybody who's known anyone, for example, who was deployed to Iraq or Afghanistan knows that even if you don't come back with post-traumatic stress disorder, people experience the aftermath of combat. For example, many veterans don't want to drive on the highway because of the noises and because of the traumatic memories of improvised explosive devices on the highways of Afghanistan, for example. And so what happens when you have experience of trauma is that everyday things, sounds, smells, noise, things like that, can really sort of erupt. They feel like they're not under our control, and then we lose it, and that's sort of a more exaggerated response to the response that we all have when something hits us, whether we're sensitive to it or not. And so I felt that we had to bolster typical parenting programs with attention to emotions. Now, I want to say really clearly that this process, I don't call it emotion coaching, this process of emotion coaching, I did not come up with. John Gottman, who's a very well-known psychologist, developed the concept of emotion coaching. Nancy Eisenberg, who's a wonderful colleague from Arizona State, she's done decades of research on how parents socialize their children's emotions. So I sort of stood on the shoulders of giants. The essential conversations came from our work with testing parenting programs that include these essential conversations. Although we didn't call them essential conversations in the program, we call it emotion coaching. So the idea from the book came from doing these programs, and we've tested them in randomized controlled trials, 4 randomized trials with over 1,000 military families, and they work. I mean, and they work in the sense that when families are randomized to be invited to participate in this program, their parenting changes not by what they say, but by what we observe. Teachers say the kids are doing better. Parents themselves feel better, less depression, less PTSD. So we know it works. And I just felt that I felt that in the US, it's not just military families have so much to teach us. And I felt like I was able to take the lessons of those who've been on the front lines literally for the past almost 20 years to all of us who now feel like we're on the front lines.
Oh, yes, for sure. So someone just asked me, this kind of goes back to what you're saying before. Girls and boys are really different in their openness and how to approach them. Have you, your examples in the book include boys and girls, but have you noticed any specific differences for parents of boys versus girls that might work better for boys? I think that's what the question's getting at.
Yeah, I think stereotypically you feel like girls, will be more open to emotions and boys less. I'll tell you, I'm a mom of 4 kids. I have 1 son and 3 daughters, and my son is more open than a couple of my girls. So, hopefully none of them are listening now. I'm teasing. No, look, he's older. But I think that I don't think it's so much about gender as about the tradition in your home, the amount of time in your home you spend talking about emotions. I have a very good friend who has 3 boys, and do they talk about emotions a lot. And then I have friends who have girls who they don't really, So I think it's more about many other things, your experiences, your own history of talking about emotions and expressing emotions, a willingness, sort of a psychological mindedness. There's definitely that part of it as well. And the thing is that our kids can't engage in something if they have no experience or exposure to it. And I think the reality in the US, we think of ourselves as advanced in so many ways, and we do have like a 50-year history of sort of a tradition of parenting advice and parenting education. But the reality is, if you look at how much we talking about emotions, it's like this much in all the parenting stuff. Really is a very small proportion of parenting advice and education. And, even in schools, I think we're just beginning to realize how important what we call SEL, social emotional learning, is. that arguably, and most people I think won't even argue with this anymore, a child being ready for school, what's more important for that school readiness than whether he or she knows his ABCs and one, two, threes, is whether he or she is able to regulate his body and his behavior to be able to sit down when it's circle time, to be able to not hit another child when he wants a toy, to be able to listen to the teacher, etc.
And what about one of the things you talked, I mean, there's a whole chapter, I think, in your book about bullying. I think that that's a really hard issue for parents because you really want to fix things for your child. And and when you say take a step back and sort of see what their solutions could be, it does seem to sort of paralyze people when it comes to bullying, both if you find out your child is doing the bullying or if you find out your child is being bullied. So what's sort of your approach with both of those?
Yeah, I have a few different scenarios in the book about bullying. I think mostly they're in the violence chapter. Um, I think I'm glad that you talked about both when their child's sort of experience, is involved in the bullying and is involved as a victim, and unfortunately there's an overlap there as well, so kids can both be bullied and be engaged in bullying. And what's complicated now is that bullying does not occur only in person. There is a lot of bullying that happens on social media, and by the way, let's be clear, it's not just children who are bullies, unfortunately,
Very.
very unfortunately. And so one of the challenges I think for parents today is, again, and this speaks to what I said earlier about the level of public discourse. We used to rely on the fact that there were standards for public discourse, and those seem to have been eroded for many reasons. And so it's harder to say, there are standards, right? You have to be the one, as a parent, you really have to teach your child. You're right. I think that the parents can easily get paralyzed with the bullying, and I think it's in part because they feel it's not just about my child, right? We all say we can have control, we can be our kids' best teachers, but if there are things here that are going on that we don't have control over, then what do we do? And I think, in the book, I lay out some different options. There's one example where there's a girl who's indirectly affected by bullying. Her boyfriend is engaged in bullying another child, and it's a very serious, like they're encouraging him to hurt himself, and it's very serious. And dad finds out, and in that situation, the girl doesn't feel empowered enough to tell her boyfriend, but dad and she, through a problem-solving process in an essential conversation, are able to come to a really, I think, an interesting agreement about inviting her boyfriend into the house. He wants to come. He wants to meet the dad. So there's a quid pro quo there. Dad gets to have a conversation. Also, I think parents and teenagers in particular can get into conflict about whether parents or how parents should engage with school people and other children's parents about this. Most kids want their parents out of it. They don't want their parents involved. And again, I'm not telling parents what to do, but how to do it. So bring your values in, having made your decisions. Some parents, for example, will say, I know you're 17, but you're still living at home. I'm still your parent. And here are my boundaries. I cannot watch this happen. And if we can't figure this out between us, or maybe part of what we figure out is I won't go to those people's parents, but I will talk to the guidance counselor, or I won't talk to the guidance counselor, but I will talk to the teacher who or whatever it is. Or if you can figure this out yourself, that's good, but I want you to know I have your back and I will be your backup. You might not like it, but so and I mean that in only, I want to be really careful. I'm not saying that in a threatening way. We should never do that, but in a very collaborative way, but while also knowing limits. And one of the things that I say in one of the very important elements to the essential conversation that we haven't talked about until now is the idea of setting limits. And so, for example, in a much more benign example, when your child is complaining about having nightmares, and you have this essential conversation, one of the things that they suggest is they sleep in your bed. And you and your spouse have decided that's not going to happen. And so it's okay to set limits and say, bed, our bed is off limits. Or a child who's scared to go to school because, let's say they have in-person school and they're scared to go to school because of the bullying. Your limit is, well, that's not on the table. You will be going to school. I mean, that's our job as parents, to set limits. And so sometimes essential conversations have to have limits, but those limits should be set at the end, right? Have your brainstorming conversation, because if you set those limits too early on, it can shut your child down.
Yeah, no, that is really helpful. And I think that, parents deal with that to minor extents and major extents. I mean, children sometimes feel that they're being made fun of or not treated well, and it's not rose to the level of bullying, and parents want to get involved, right? Which is, I think, so smart to not.
Yep.
So it turns out we've almost made the whole hour here. I know, it really. So I guess I was wondering, maybe is there anything that you wanted to add, especially for people who may not have read the book, that maybe we didn't get to or touch on? I'm surprised the hour went by so fast.
I looked at I was like, what?
I know. Wow, that's crazy.
Well, I want to say, if you go on my website, which is abigailgewirtz.com, and maybe someone can put that in the chat, you can see two conversations. There's a conversation about COVID on the front page, and then if you go to the blog, what I've done, and I did this in the summer in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, there's a conversation about racial injustice as well. Look, I will say something really, and by the way, if you do choose to get the book, I would be incredibly grateful if you could put a review on Amazon or Goodreads or somewhere, because that's really helpful, I think, for other people. What I will say, and I joke that this is what I'm going to say in the next edition of the book, is that parents, I think, really, not only do they have it so hard now, they're expected to be parents and teachers and full-time workers, many of them, at the same time. There is a lack of attention to compassion and forgiveness to ourselves. We set ourselves high standards, and that makes us even more stressed. I think if there's one message I want to convey, which is, please forgive yourselves. Please allow yourselves to have compassion, have self-compassion. Because if we can't forgive ourselves and understand that what we're going through is probably, in the context of the world that we normally live in, and one of the most stressful situations, we are going to have a hard time being able to forgive and be compassionate towards others. So if for nothing else, do it in order to help your kids. But please, my goal is not to make parents feel bad about the red lights, but really to see the opportunity, particularly now when we're all at home, to have conversations with your children.
Yeah, I agree. And also, your role modeling compassion for yourself will also take a little bit off their shoulders. They will be able to give compassion to themselves when they screw up too, which we all do.
Absolutely.
Well, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for joining the JCC Book Festival. And I'm just so thankful we were able to do this today.
Well, it was a treat to be in dialogue with you, Julie. So thank you. And thanks to everyone for organizing.
I just wanted to hop on and thank both of you so much. I'm Deborah Bobrow from the GCC. This was really a wonderful addition to our book festival this year. I want to especially thank Dr. Julie Hertzer from Advanced Pediatrics for agreeing to do this today, and of course our special guest, Dr. Abby Gewirtz. Her website is abigailgewirtz.com. And if you're interested in purchasing the book, which is a really great read and very helpful for parents of children of all ages, our partner is Max Back's Books on Coventry. You can also get it in other places, but we love to support our local folks. So thank you again. Thanks to our wonderful sponsors and our audience members. Thank you, thank you, thank you. All right, so long.